Hey everyone, Joshua has asked me to talk to you about Tunis to Sydney. Tunis to Sydney is written by Meriam and Christian Carnouche, illustrated by Sam Rapley, lettered by Dawn J. Starr and Cardinal Ray, edited by Fabrice Sapolsky, and co-edited by James B. Emmett. Big trigger warning for grief in Tunis to Sydney. This is one of the main themes of this story. Please take care of yourself. And if you feel yourself getting upset by the discussion later on, it's totally fine to step away for a few minutes or to just focus on the ducks. What ducks, you say? I hope you like ducks, or this is going to be a weird comic book club for you. I want to be clear that ducks have nothing to do with this story. I just like using a duck as my avatar. I've placed at least one duck on each slide. It's like a Where's Wally, but with ducks. Where's Waddle, if you will. I'd also like to flag that although I am also culturally Muslim, like the main character Lilia in Tunis to Sydney, we are not a monolith and my family is not from Tunisia. While the greatest of care has been taken to attempt correct pronunciation of words and names and to get the facts right, apologies if some mispronunciation occurs or if I'm mistaken about some of the facts. Meriam and Christian Carnouche co-wrote Tunis to Sydney and are a transnational couple. Meriam may be even more social media shy than me. Her Instagram describes her as translator, love photography, architecture, film, literature, art and fashion. Meriam has a Tunisian background. TTS was Meriam's idea, including the protagonist Lilia, the death of her parents, the olive tree, and Meriam's real-life experience of attempting to smuggle something in the airport. Christian did the heavy lifting in terms of working out the initial draft. Christian has a little more of a social media presence. He is the Australian creator, writer, publisher of the comic books The Resurrected and Murky Waters. Successful Kickstarters were run in 2018, 2019 and 2020 in order to print these books. He is currently pitching his first novel, a philosophical coming-of-age story set in Sydney in the 1990s. Dungeons and Dragons is one of his true loves of his life, created the year he was born. He describes himself as a geriatric skateboarder and criminologist. Christian's from Sydney, but has worked for several years in the Netherlands. Oddly enough, the Carnouches do have a country in common, France, as Christian's father is from Marseille, and Meriam went to a French high school and lived in Paris for a long time. Although some small things were complicated early on, like, dealing with differences of culture and ethnicity and religion, the Carnouches say that maybe they navigated this successfully because so many of their friends are transnational couples as well. There is one thing, though, that Christian will never understand about the Tunisian culture, and it's that the evil eye is real, which is the idea that malevolent, envious glare will bring about a curse. It is tricky for the Carnouches to pin down a favourite moment in TTS, but there is a scene that they feel speaks to the tension that can develop between a couple when one of them is processing loss and the other is doing their best to support them, but there is a communication disconnect. Bill tries to talk to Lilia after she has returned home from a failed attempt to purchase a baby olive tree to replace the one in quarantine. She is angry at him for not supporting her, while he is lost about what more he can do. They've had their own similar situations, so it feels very real. The Carnouches feel that in a lot of ways it is easier to collaborate with a partner who knows you on a deep level rather than with another creator in the industry. Although they have quite different personalities, the couple have similar values and a respectful relationship, and this carried over seamlessly to their collaboration. They have learnt that it's fine to disagree with each other and that it's important to express how they feel, which helped them get through the writing without any major dramas. They had also worked on a short comic together previously, House of Cracks, which they co-created with Dev Pramanik and Triona Farrell in 2021 and published in Christian's Murky Waters psychological horror anthology. So they already had a good idea about the type of stories they both wanted to tell and how best to collaborate. They are delighted to have created something wonderful to show their daughter when she grows up, and they feel that all the research they did about Sydney and Tunis helps them learn even more about each other's home and culture. the most challenging thing was probably finding the time where they could both sit down together. They were both busy with work and got even busier when their daughter was born. So they did a lot of work separately and would only really sit down together to go through their ideas. There were quite a few long breaks in work, and TTS took longer than if they were writing it alone. Thankfully, Sam, the artist on the book, was very patient and easy to work with, not to mention his art being the heart and soul of Lilia's journey. Speaking of Sam, let's go meet him. Oops, how'd that get there? One sec. I thought the writers were shy, but dang, the illustrator has even less of an internet presence. His Ko-fi says, "Hey, I'm Sam. I'm a comic book illustrator and generally just a big old fan of drawing all kinds of stuff." Fortunately for me, his collaborators, the Carnouches, had some things to add in their interview with ETTO Comics. Sam is a self-trained artist. Tunis to Sydney is Sam's first full-length book. The authors gushed about how Sam was the perfect collaborator. They were lucky enough to have found him on Twitter through #PortfolioDay, and after he drew some test pages, there was no doubt that his fresh and unique style was perfectly suited to their story. He was also super easy and reliable to work with and emotionally invested in the story, so they felt like it was a true collaboration rather than a simple work for hire. They couldn't imagine Lilia being drawn by anyone else, which is such a lovely compliment. There are quite a few scenes with no dialogue in TTS, mostly involving Lilia processing her grief, and Sam captured these emotional beats that let the story breathe and allowed the reader to take the time to reflect on Lilia's journey. She's a quiet sufferer, and Sam has a wonderful ability to communicate her feelings. Flashbacks also play a key role in illustrating Lilia's journey, and Sam draws them in an aesthetically pleasing way and manages to transition these scenes back to the present with an emotional punch. Look out for his sweeping splash pages, including Sydney Harbour from above, Marsa Plage in Tunis, Lilia soaring like a phoenix to the surface of the ocean. Sam also draws nature effortlessly. Oceans, below the sea, sand, soil, gardens, and plants. Whatever the writers asked him to draw, he did, and with his own spin. The writers knew it was going to be a risk working with an artist who was not from the region, but they were both so impressed by how well Sam drew the Tunis scenes. A lot of research went into his work too. Tunisia and North Africa as a whole is such a melting pot of history and cultures that they thought a non-Tunisian might struggle to recreate the city and its peoples. For example, the scene where Lilia is lost in the souk. Meriam was also impressed by how well Sam drew Arabic script and jokes that Sam has now earned his degree in Arabic script. To create TTS, the Carnouches started off with the core idea of Lilia wanting to bring a baby olive tree back to Sydney from Tunis, and they built the story from there. A few scenes were also inspired by actual events. There's a quarantine interdiction scene that I'll mention again later, but also the scene where Bill and Lilia are riding a tandem bicycle, and Bill is embarrassed to be seen on it. That totally happened. Even though TTS is a work of fiction and Lilia and Bill are not meant to represent the Carnouches, there are quite a few similarities to their own situation, and not just because they are a Tunisian-Australian couple, but particularly because they have both lived and worked overseas for a long time, first in Europe and now in New York City. And for them, this really is the main theme of the book. Lilia's struggle to find home and belonging, not just because she is a foreigner, but because she grew up in a culture so different to that in Australia. Thinking about how much of Bill and Lilia reflect them, the Carnouches say Bill and Lilia have very different personalities, but there is a kernel of truth in the tension they have because of Bill being a bit of a goody-goody when it comes to rules. Also, they both grew up in countries where the ocean and sea play have such important roles in their day-to-day lives, which is why TTS featured some of their favourite beaches in Sydney, Tunis and Jerba. Although the writers of TTS are Australian, and this is story partially set in Australia, my local brick and mortar comic book store was surprised at how hard it was to order a physical copy of TTS. In the end, it took about a month to arrive, and the trade paperback cost me just over $50 Australian. To compare, the trade paperback of Seven Secrets was just under $35 Australian for me. There doesn't seem to be a way to buy an e-copy of TTS at this stage either, so this comic is a real dickens to get if you are in Australia. There's some irony in this situation. If the price point is a bit high for you and you have access to a local public library, you could encourage your library to order it in for you. We're so grateful that the authors kindly provided Joshi with an e-copy so that the ETTO Comic Book Club could review this. I presume the difficulties we encountered is because the publisher isn't a household name like Marvel or DC and is based in the US. So, I better segue into introducing Fair Square Graphics. Fair Square Graphics is a family, immigrant, and minority-owned publisher dedicated to amplifying diverse voices in comics and graphic novels. Its mission is to elevate the work of underrepresented creators, including immigrants, minorities, and LGBTQ+ artists, following their guiding mantra, comics from the rest of us. Fair Square Graphics has released over 45 titles since its creation in 2019, including the hit graphic novels Noir is the New Black, A Fox in My Brain, Intertwined, No Kidding, and the Eisner Harvey Award-nominated A Boy Named Rose. Around October 2024, Fair Square Graphics announced an agreement with Sandstone Artists, which is set to explore new horizons for Fair Square Graphics' original content in film, television, and multimedia. Kevin Nicholas, who is the Sandstone Artist partner and head of production, brings an established track record of adapting content for the screen, including notable projects such as The Beginning After the End, which is on Crunchyroll or Fuji TV, and a series of horror films based on the works of renowned Japanese manga artist Junji Ito. Fabrice Sapolsky, who is the co-owner of Fair Square Graphics, says, Fair Square Graphics has always strived to be a champion for voices that often go unheard in the entertainment industry. This partnership with Sandstone Artists aligns perfectly with our mission, opening doors for our creators and stories to reach a global audience in bold, new formats. So hopefully we'll be hearing more about Fair Square Graphics projects in the future. When we were doing this presentation live for Comic Book Club, this was the point where I checked if my internet was still working or if my sound was still working, but I'm leaving it in so you can have a look at this beautiful art and also this dog. Synopsis time. Tunis to Sydney is a slice-of-life graphic novel about home, belonging, and grief, and is the story of Lilia, a Tunisian swimming coach living in Sydney with her Australian husband Bill. Life is good, and the two are happy, but Lilia's world falls apart when she receives the news that her parents died in a car accident 10,000 miles away in Tunisia, where Lilia was raised. I'm going to assume everyone listening is pretty familiar with Sydney and Australia, but maybe less familiar with Tunisia. So, for context, Tunisia is the northernmost country in Africa, bordering the Mediterranean Sea, and Tunis is the capital and largest city of the country. The official language of Tunisia is Modern Standard Arabic, although I believe a Tunisian Arabic dialect is the most spoken, as well as some French. The vast majority of Tunisia's population is Arab and Muslim. Please note that not all Arabs are Muslim and not all Muslims are Arab. Today, Tunisia's culture and identity are rooted in centuries-long intersection of different cultures and ethnicities, which is just perfect for this story. So Lilia and Bill travel back to Tunisia so Lilia can make funeral arrangements for her parents and to begin grappling with this massive life event. Lilia is consumed with thoughts about grief, builds resilience in the face of loss, and explores the complexities of human relationships. This summary is quite brief, but I don't want to ruin it for you if you do choose to pick this comic up. This is one of those stories where the journey is more important than the destination. A key plot point of TTS is that Lilia's grief pushes her to smuggle a baby olive tree owned by her parents back to Australia, triggering a dramatic situation and ultimately catharsis. I'm super glad that the comic addresses the fact that bringing a random plant into Australia is in fact a crime. No joke, there's a real possibility of serious fines and jail time. My first reading of the comic, I was so concerned that they would just have no consequences and then we'd have rainbows and unicorns. Instead, it's made clear that Lilia is very lucky to be let off with a warning, and this situation is a big part of the swirling emotions that Lilia is dealing with. Fun fact, the whole quarantine interdiction scene was inspired by Meriam's first trip to Sydney in 2010, where she was confronted by a quarantine officer after unknowingly smuggling 2 oranges into the country. Don't bring random plants into the country, kids. The story of Tunis to Sydney was inspired by the Carnouches having lived overseas for so long, far from both countries where they grew up. The 2 creators said they hadn't planned for Tunis to Sydney to delve too deeply into themes of trauma and therapy, but it ended up going that way when they tapped into a personal fear. When you live in a different country to your loved ones, there is a constant fear hanging over your head that you may lose a loved one at any moment. Not only would you have to process the trauma, but how would you feel about missing out on their last moments and not being able to say goodbye to them in person? Which is exactly what happened to Christian not long after he moved to the Netherlands, when one of his closest family members was terminally ill and ended up passing the day before Christian was scheduled to fly home to see him. Although they spoke on the telephone literally seconds before he died, it still haunts him that he wasn't able to hold them as he said goodbye. The Carnouches noted in their interview with Comics Beat how they'd feel if they lost their parents or any other close family members while living overseas is an issue that they both spoke about at length a few years ago when Christian was writing his first comic book series, The Resurrected, which advanced the idea how you deal with death defines the person you will become. Grief and loss are things that people will inevitably experience at some point in their lives, and Meriam and Christian offer some advice for those who may be going through a similar experience. We genuinely feel that the writing process has helped us process these anxieties, and we would recommend other creators to take similar journeys and engage in artistic endeavors in dealing with trauma or any anxiety really. It was through mapping Lilia's journey of trauma, guilt, acceptance, and forgiveness that the Carnouches found some comfort in their situation, and they hope TTS will have a similar effect on anyone who reads the book. We hope too that our story can show readers that they are not alone in their grief and that it is something that will affect each and every single one of us. There is not one correct way to deal with grief, and you have to be gentle and forgiving on yourselves and on others, just as our protagonist learns by the end of the book, after beating herself up and falling into a deep depression after the death of her parents. They added, one of our friends and previous comic book collaborators, Jay Sheik, posted recently that one of his old friends had passed at the same time he was reading Tunis to Sydney, and that Lilia's journey had helped him understand that dealing with grief is about learning that letting go of regrets can open a door for profound growth, absolution, and peace. We really hope other readers dealing with similar issues can even find just a tiny bit of solace from our story. Meriam and Christian dedicated TTS to the loving memory of their nephew, Maximilian Maxi Crumb, whose smile brightened their world. That last bit made me super sad when I first read about it, so here are some free ducks to help you rally. Although TTS can be read as just a journey through grief, it's not just about that. First, the setting in TTS is just as vital as the people. Sometimes your grief for a person gets twisted up in grief for the place. In their interview with ETTO Comics, the Carnouches said that they hoped to bring the cities and their people to the forefront of the story to highlight the differences in the two worlds that Lilia straddles. The bustling and hectic Medina versus the relaxed beaches in Sydney's eastern suburbs. They also used certain locations as both emotional and physical anchors for Lilia, and they featured places that were meaningful to them personally. They also thought this would help give the reader a better sense of these two worlds. What really struck me was this understated sense of belonging in both worlds, but also being separate from them. Where is home? It can be tricky to explain to people who aren't migrants or mixed race, but basically you can feel like you fit in everywhere and also belong nowhere. It's very unsettling, and you can really sense it when Lilia is passing through the cemetery in Sydney, and again when she gets lost in the Medina in Tunis. Second, the culture is gently woven into the story. Writer Meriam has to constantly explain where Tunisia is, what languages they speak, and why she is from the African continent but not black. Hopefully, Tunis to Sydney will play a small role in bringing a sense of Tunisia in its diversity and culture to the world. For me, it was interesting seeing a depiction of people who are culturally Muslim, but not necessarily religiously Muslim. And thank goodness, this is not a story about a Muslim Arab woman questioning the place of women in society. Tunisian women are actually famously fierce and independent, and the Carnouches wrote Lilia as an example for the world to see this strength. In Arab and Muslim cultures, there is quite a bit of focus on duty and responsibility within the family unit, including looking after one's parents in their old age. Lilia, who is an only child, moving so far from her parents and her home was a huge decision for her, and one that she has never quite come to terms with, meaning that the death of her parents deals her a double blow. Her guilt is twofold. She moved across the world from her family, and she was not there for them when they passed. Finally, nature plays a huge role in this comic. Water and soil are integral to TTS, and the writers weaved these motifs into Lilia's journey. They intentionally made Lilia a swimming instructor as a means of reinforcing her connection to the sea, and Lilia literally wants to replant the North African roots of the baby olive tree in Australian soil, which she thinks will help her not only finally accept her husband's country as her own home, but allow her to carry a little piece of her parents with her. When her efforts are thwarted, the water becomes her place of belonging, as it is familiar and comforting, a bit like home, and no matter where she goes, it will always welcome her into its arms. I just wanted to share some of the last thoughts of some of our club members and some of their favourite panels. Amma Glitter said that they loved the use of this extremely soft, loose, washed out watercolor art style to represent the transition into a flashback in these panels to the right. Also, the sheer joy they got from seeing familiar looking locations. They're so used to comics with, spider people swinging through New York or whatever, so it was a breath of fresh air to be able to point to something and say, that's my city. Finally, they said, we need more stories where Australian men talk to each other about their feelings, please, like the panels in the middle. Overall rating, Emma Glitter gave 4 out of 5 olive trees. The Coastal City said, the art is phenomenal. There is something both ethereal and yet very whimsical, as the work feels soft and expressive. Incredible balance that would take a lot of time to perfect. Diablo Kyle said that their favourite panel was showing off the garden and the rays of light coming through. Co-host Joshi has given us a lovely review. Overall, it's a good story about one person's experience with grief and exploring the facets of it. I will say it was hard to have sympathy for Lily at times despite her having lost her parents. The biosecurity thing really aggravated me with how flagrantly and egotistically she thought she could just violate it without consequences. In addition, Lilia's treatment of Bill at times is harsh, like, she's lashing out from grief. Like the panel where she tells Bill he was born and raised in Sydney and then he'll die in Sydney and even be buried in Sydney. Or the moment where they're at border security and Bill's working hard to make sure Lilia doesn't go to prison for a decade. That said, Bill should have kept his trap shut at the restaurant. Ultimately, a partner shouldn't be used as an emotional punching post, and I know they moved past it, but it felt brushed past rather than resolved. I like the moments of metaphor and symbolism, like Lilia talking about making sure the plants are watered or they'll wither away, while showing a picture of the dead parents. Also cool to learn about bits of culture of Tunis, like the 40th day, a traditional service in memory of the departed on the 40th day post-death. The environmental art is phenomenal, especially anything underwater. There's one panel with Lilia submerged with some sand kicked up, which takes a full page that is just glorious. I think the actual art of the people sometimes had too many lines depending on the panel. Bill looked anywhere from late 20s to early 60s, but the color palette and the environments rendered any complaints moot. Rating 1 out of 1 cute doggo companions. This was Laughing Seal's favourite panel. The chat said, "This one is too real. It perfectly encapsulates trying to sleep the night before an early flight." Thank you very much for listening to this ETTO Comic Book Club chat about Tunis to Sydney. And now it's time to go back to Joshi and discuss 7 secrets.